Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Truth Conversation. The theme for tonight so far has been technical issues, so we're very sorry that we're a little bit late. We have a really wonderful program for you tonight. We have Professors Holly Ordway and Louis Markos with us tonight, and they are, I would call them Inklings experts. If anybody in the world's Inklings experts, it's these two. And so I'm going to give them a moment just to introduce themselves and let you get to know them. And we're going to get into a conversation about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and just their lives and ministry and influence and one another. So we'll let Holly go first. Holly, would you tell us who you are a little bit? Oh, sorry.
I think I need to be.
I had you muted. There we go.
Well, thanks for having me on, Bill. So, as you will observe my introduction, I'm Holly Ordway. So, I'm the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, to the Catholic ministry devoted to evangelization. I'm also a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University, where I taught full-time for 8 years before shifting over to Word on Fire. So, very happy to be back on the show and to continue my connection with HCU as a visiting professor. So my Inkling specialty is Tolkien. And so far I've written 2 books about Tolkien. One of them, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, which focused on Tolkien as kind of what he read, what he read of modern literature, and then Tolkien's Faith, biography, which focused on, his biography of faith. And here we have the 2 books that are coming out. I wasn't sure if you were trying to signal me to be quicker in my comments, so I will now wrap up and when you get hand signals from the host, like you say, is this the cutoff signal? Is this the stop signal? No. Alrighty. Yeah, so I've written these 2 books, one looking more at 2 books on Tolkien. I've written other books on apologetics and literature. These 2 books on Tolkien, placing him kind of in his context as a reader and showing that he really was highly engaged with modern culture. He was not a Luddite. He was not hiding himself away. He was a medievalist, but also someone who really engaged deeply with modern culture. And then Tolkien's Faith is a biography of him, and it came out just in time for the 50th anniversary of his death, which was September 2nd of last year, 2023. I can't believe it's 2024 already. And so it's a spiritual biography tracing his life with a focus on his spiritual life. And that's something that surprisingly had never been done. You would have thought, but no, it hadn't been done. So that's my major work on Tolkien thus far.
Thank you very much, Holly. And now we're going to let Dr. Louis Markos, tell us a little bit about himself, his works, his writings, his ministry, all of it.
Hey, Bill. Well, thanks for having me on as well. I'm looking forward to doing that cruise along with Holly, my colleague, and also one of the best teachers my son ever had. He did the cultural apologetics major at HCU when it was still HBU. I am an English professor and scholar in residence. I've been at HCU for almost 33 years now. I came in 1991, and I teach Lewis and Tolkien. I also teach the Romantics and Victorians, and I'm also a classics guy, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And if there's one thing that really defines my writing, my scholarship, my speaking, it's about bringing Athens and Jerusalem together, bringing together our Judeo-Christian legacy and our Greco-Roman legacy, and showing that they can come together. And both Lewis and Tolkien were scholars who learned a great deal from pre-Christian writers and were able to strengthen their own faith. And I've written a lot on both of them, but the one I would highlight for our cruise is a book I wrote called On the Shoulders of Hobbits, The Road to Virtue with Tolkien and Lewis. And I was surprised that there aren't that many books that talk about Tolkien and Lewis at the same time, particularly not about Narnia and Middle-earth, when you think there would be. Sort of like Holly said with her book. It's like, why did nobody write that? Well, let's go ahead and do that and look for common themes in both of their works. Their focus on the four classical virtues and the three theological virtues. Their focus on friendship. Their focus on the idea of being a pilgrim on the road. Also, their focus on what is the nature of evil. Both of them were very Augustinian. Evil is a negation or a privation of good. And so anything having to do with Narnia or Middle Earth or Lewis or Tolkien, and again, Lewis and Tolkien were apologists for the Christian faith, but they were also apologists for friendship. We live in an age when male friendship, particularly, is under attack and under suspicion. So they were apologists for friendship, and they were also apologists for the Middle Ages. And both Narnia and Middle Earth are very much medieval places, living in a hierarchical, meaningful cosmos. Both Holly and I have been influenced by Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia. And he's right that when we go to Narnia and Middle Earth, we sort of breathe in what it was like to live in the Middle Ages when people lived in an ordered and meaningful cosmos. And it's going to be great to talk about these issues while we're on the high seas. It's going to be very exciting.
Yes, and it's neat, Lou, that you emphasize these sort of underlying themes, because that's something that really I tried to unpack in Tolkien's faith as well. This idea that Tolkien's work is fundamentally religious, and that fundamentally is really important, because it's not about spotting a Christian symbol here and a Christian symbol there. I mean, there are those present, but it's about identifying what are the fundamental issues, the beliefs, the virtues. And I think that, I mean, you're right, Lou, there hasn't been enough work tracing those things. You would think there would be, but there surprisingly hasn't been. So it's a good book. You're on the shoulders of hobbits. I recommend it to listeners.
Thanks. And I've got a review of your book coming out in the St. Austin Review in the next few months, Tolkien's Faith. So it's really an exciting time to be around. We have not delved everything there is of these two men and their work and their faith. I mean, there's so much to learn from. And I got to say one more thing, and I think Holly's like this too, that you don't understand how important it was for academic Christians to have people like Tolkien and Lewis who lived out their faith in an academic world. They didn't do altar calls in their classroom, but their faith was a part of everything they did. And so it's important for professors like Holly and I that being a Christian doesn't mean leaving your brain outside or something. It means being fully engaged in all areas of life, all aspects of life. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so Tolkien and Lewis are role models in so many different ways.
Absolutely. And that was something that was a discovery for me when I did the research for Tolkien's faith, because I knew that he personally lived out his faith, in his personal life and his interrelations with his students. But what I didn't realize until I did the research for the book was how he was a very visible role model. In Catholic academia, there were very few in Oxford. In Oxford, England of that time, in the university, there were very, very few Catholics, and there weren't all that many serious Christians. It was becoming, much more secularized. So for someone to be visible as, here I am, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, and to turn up at events and to be willing to be identified as, oh yeah, he's that guy, as opposed to privatizing or compartmentalizing his faith. No, he was present and visible, and people knew what he believed. And I think that is maybe even makes him more important as a role model now in 2024 than it did even, in the 1930s and 40s and 50s.
That's true,
Well,
Holly.
there was a picture in your photo gallery. What was the picture where Tolkien was participating in a sort of Catholic ceremony outside? What was that? I'm trying to remember the image in my head, but he was participating in it.
Yeah, well, that actually, the image you're thinking of doesn't actually have Tolkien in it. It was a representative
Oh,
image.
oh,
There is no graphic evidence, the one that
oh,
you're talking about. But what it is, it's a procession of the Blessed Sacrament,
okay.
with it's called the baldachin, carried over the sacrament as it's processed through the streets of Oxford. And the interesting thing is that in the 1930s, Tolkien was actually one of the professors who carried the sort of an honor guard, you might say, honor guard for Christ, going through the streets of Oxford. The first time that this has been held since the Reformation, so it was a pretty public statement of his faith. And there are no photographs of that exact one, but I was able to track down a photograph of a similar procession from the very church that he attended frequently in Oxford, and so that turned up in the photo gallery of the book.
So
we're
what
getting very talking. So now over to you, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say we're getting way sidetracked from our plan here, but that's okay because it's so interesting. What Holly's talking about here, guys, by the way, is Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. This book that she's just written. I want her to talk to us about it for a good 10 minutes, but it's got a huge photo gallery, full color, beautiful thing in the middle of it. This book is worth every penny you pay for it if you're a Tolkien fan, because it really helps you understand his life, who he was, his background, and I learned some fascinating things that I didn't, even as a person who did most of his undergraduate work in history before I switched over to biblical studies and things. I had no clue what it was like to be, say, a Catholic in early 20th century England and things like that. It's just such a fascinating read, and how these two guys, you have C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, they have influenced so many minds, so many academic thinkers, so many lay people through their works like Chronicles of Narnia, Screwtape Letters, the whole body of literature that surrounds Middle-earth, not just The Lord of the Rings, but Silmarillion, all the side works that Tolkien's son helped publish after his passing, all kinds of things. These guys were brilliant. And so I wanted to give each one of these guys, both Dr. Markos and Dr. Ordway, time to kind of talk about, where these guys were coming from theologically, just like a brief biography, and how these two guys met each other, and I want, Tolkien and Lewis, and how Tolkien led C.S. Lewis out of atheism to Christianity. It's just it's a wonderful story. So let's get this story in. We're going to start with Holly, and with a little bit of Tolkien's backstory, and give us some background, give us some context to Middle Earth through the eyes of Tolkien and his life, if you don't mind, Dr. Ordway.
Right. Don't twist my arm. So interestingly, Tolkien was born in South Africa, in Bloemfontein, South Africa, to parents Mabel and Arthur, who were Church of England. And when Mabel and her two sons, Tolkien and J.R.R. Tolkien, and his little brother Hilary, were in England on what was supposed to be a short visit, while their father was continuing to work in South Africa, Arthur died suddenly, leaving Mabel widowed and the young children without a father. And so Mabel was then left to bring up her two children on her own. And a few years later, Mabel decided to become a Catholic, received into the Catholic Church. And so at the age of 8, young John Ronald Reuel began to learn about a whole, new aspect of being a Christian, new prayers, new environments, and a big change in many ways, because Catholicism was not a respectable way to express your faith in England in the early 20th century, to say the least. Catholics were socially marginalized, they were economically marginalized, they had suffered greatly under the penal laws that had actually made practicing the faith illegal for a couple centuries. They hadn't gotten all of their civil rights back until the mid 1800s. So it was really a tough situation for Mabel, and her family thoroughly disapproved, cut off financial help, and this caused a great deal of suffering to the young family. And Mabel eventually died when Tolkien was 12 of diabetes, which at that point was untreatable. They didn't know anything about insulin yet. And he and his little brother were put under the guardianship of Father Francis Morgan, a priest of the Birmingham Oratory. And so Tolkien ended up growing up in the context of this community of priests and brothers, who were a very interesting community. Many of them were converts. They come from Anglican backgrounds to become Catholic. And so they understood what it was like to have taken the journey that Mabel and her sons had taken. And very importantly, for Tolkien's future sort of formation, they were not afraid of Protestants. They were not hostile. They recognized that these are our brothers in Christ, and they were able to help Tolkien to learn how to live in this environment where he was part of a religious minority. He went to King Edward's School, which was sort of very religiously mixed. In fact, there were even Jewish students there. And then much excitement about he fell in love as a teenager, and this caused a lot of disruption, but he was actually forbidden to see his beloved for a few years, but eventually married her. He goes off to Oxford, again, in a new environment, a much very secular environment, gets his education, gets married just in time to go off to the First World War. He serves actually in the trenches of the Great War, this horrific experience, and gets through it with his faith intact, his health damaged, but his faith intact. Although after the war, he ended up having a stretch when he really, he said, I almost ceased to practice my religion. Almost, didn't entirely. But he went through a long stretch that was really a dry spell. And I think that's something important about him. He wasn't, a perfect Christian, hatched out of the egg, as it were. He had struggles. He had difficulties. He had dry patches. And then he eventually gets a position, a professor at Oxford University, and that's where he ends up meeting Lewis. Now, I'm about to hand over to Lou, but I want to point out a couple of interesting things about Tolkien's formation that kind of set him up to be this good friend to Lewis. And that was that he had from the beginning a very sort of ecumenical mindset. He was raised as a devout Catholic, and he sustained his faith through the war. Despite the dry spell, he held on to his faith, but he was always very ready to have friendships with other Christians, indeed with non-Christians, but certainly, and that was important because when he met Lewis, Lewis was at that point an atheist. So Tolkien is notable in that he knew his own faith. He was very secure in his faith, but he was very broad-minded and big-hearted in his ability to relate to other people who might not share his same perspective. And then from that place of kind of security, of confidence, he could have these conversations. And that's what happened with with Lewis, which I think now is my cue to hand this over to Lou.
Dr. Markos is a C.S. Lewis extraordinaire, so we'll let Dr. Markos discuss C.S. Lewis, his history, background, and how these two men converged, and they had a lot in common, didn't they?
They did, really. Let me just focus on a few things that created not just Lewis the Christian, but Lewis the creator of Narnia, right? So just like Tolkien was not born in England, neither was C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast, back then North Ireland. Well, I mean, back then Ireland, now North Ireland. And he grew up in Belfast. And it's interesting because his father was the more emotional one, and his mother was the sort of more logical one. And Lewis tended to favor his mother. He was a little bit more logical, a little more guarded, rational and whatnot. But it's almost like God would not allow Lewis to become too much in the rational. He needed to keep alive the imaginative, the emotional, the part of Lewis that would create Narnia. And so Lewis wrote a spiritual autobiography called Surprised by Joy. And even though he eventually married a woman named Joy, that's not what it's about. It's about experiences Lewis had from his very early childhood, and he called these experiences joy. Now, I'll give you an example. Lewis was very young and he was suffering from toothache. And his brother Warnie, he had a brother, Tolkien had a younger brother named Hilary. Lewis had an older brother named Warnie. And by the way, I should mention that Lewis was 6 years younger than Tolkien. most people imagine them being the same age. And, if they met as teenagers, they never would have been friends. But I think when they met, Lewis was about 27. I think Tolkien was about 33. And by then, I guess the years didn't make a difference. But I think most of us imagine them as the same age. So anyway, but they were both born during the Victorian age, which is very important to remember. So anyway, Lewis is suffering from toothache. His brother Warney, to cheer up his brother, took the lid of a biscuit tin. He turned it upside down. He put little pieces of moss and twigs in there, and he created a little toy garden. And he brought it out to his brother. His nickname was Jack. And he said, "Look, Jack." And Lewis said, when he looked at that little thing, he was suddenly swept away to warm, moist, green places. And he said from there to the end of his life, his image of heaven was always influenced a little bit by his brother's toy garden. Now, you need to understand that that toy garden was just a really cheesy thing. There was nothing beautiful about it, but something in that toy garden triggered. Normally, Bill, I hate the word triggered, but here's a good use of the word. Something in that triggered something deep in Lewis, and it swept him away. It sort of transported him away from our material world and gave him a glimpse of something higher. This happened. Another example, he walked into a room and he saw a book open, and he read the book and he read these words: "I heard a voice that cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead." Now, at this point, Lewis didn't know much about Norse mythology or about Balder, but when he read those words, they were written by Longfellow, he suddenly felt transported to cold northern places. He called it northernness. The point here is that even as Lewis was trying to become very, very logical and self protective, it's like God kept sending him these little intimations of heaven, these moments of joy. He used the German word Sehnsucht, a sort of joy or yearning for something beyond this world. And so always that side of Lewis was kept open. Well, like Tolkien, Lewis became an orphan. When Lewis was 9 years old, his mother died. And although his father did not die for many years afterwards, Lewis and his father became somewhat estranged because Lewis's father, rather than drawing the boys close to himself, sent them off to one of those terrible British boarding schools you hear about in movies. And Lewis absolutely hated it. Warney liked it because he ended up becoming a soldier. He liked sports and all of that stuff. But Lewis just hated the nonsense of it. And it gave him a yearning for vacation and Christmas that was almost like a yearning for heaven. Read the last line of Last Battle and you'll see the term is over. The summer is beginning, right? The holidays have come. So Lewis kept begging his father to take him out of these horrible schools. And finally, his father sent him to a private tutor in Surrey, England. And that private tutor's name was Kirkpatrick, but his nickname was the Great Knock, because this guy was a no-nonsense atheist empiricist who believed in absolutely pure logic. And between the ages of 16 and 18, Lewis had his mind just honed like a knife. It was logic, logic, logic. Now, you might have thought that Lewis would have lost all of his love of imagination, and he was doing that because he was an atheist by now. But then God always intervenes. One day, while Lewis was going back home, he took the train to the ferry to the train. When he was on the train, he would always go to a bookstall and just buy a cheap paperback and read it. And it just so happened that day, he bought a book by George MacDonald called Fantastes. It is a crazy fantasy with almost no plot, where this man gets transported to a magical world. He's almost killed by an evil tree, and then he's saved by a good tree. All these amazing things happen. Now, Lewis read the book, and he said that something happened when he read that book. It opened up his mind to holiness. He didn't have a word for it yet, but it opened his mind to something holy and sacred. And Lewis says, after he finished reading Fantastes, it baptized his imagination. The rest of me, he said, naturally took longer. But right there in the midst of pure Lewis, the atheist, rationalist, materialist, naturalist, God reaches in through a fairy tale written by a Christian, but you might not notice per se it's Christian. Lewis read that, and again, it triggered that old sense of joy. But Lewis went on. He went on to be a professor, a don, as they call it, in Oxford, and friendship with Tolkien helped lead him to faith. The two of them met because of their mutual love for Norse mythology and for the from Sweden and places like that. And they loved those languages. And Tolkien invited Lewis to join a group called the Coal Biters or the Coal Bitars. And the Coal Biters were the old Vikings who, during the winter, would sit close to the fire and tell stories. And they were so close to the fire, it was like they were biting the coals. And the whole purpose of the group was to read all of those famous Norse sagas, the prose Edda, the poetic Edda, the Volsung saga, read through them in the original languages. And they eventually disbanded the group because they read everything. But Lewis and Tolkien continued to be friends. They have a mutual love of things like Beowulf and Norse languages. They also believe firmly that education should be very much language based and not just literature based. So they remain friends. But Lewis, even though about the age of 30, he became a theist, he became to believe in God, one God, he still couldn't believe in Christianity because Lewis felt like Christianity sounded too much like a myth. I mean, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Norsemen, they all have a story that sounds like Christ, of a sort of dying and rising God. And Lewis could not get over that. And then one day, when he was 32 years old, he and Tolkien, and there was another man named Hugo Dyson, another believer, and as they walked along Addison's Walk, it's a beautiful tree-lined lane in Magdalen College, Oxford. And as they walked around and around deep into the night, they were discussing this image. And Lewis said, I can't, what does it make a difference that this Jewish rabbi died 2,000 years? It had nothing to do with me, right? And then Tolkien said the words that not only changed Lewis's life, but changed the life of millions of people. He said, Jack, did you ever wonder maybe the reason that Christianity sounds like a myth is that Jesus is the myth that came true, the myth that was made fact, right? I could spend forever, but just in a nutshell, if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law and prophets. What Lewis came to understand, with the help of Tolkien and other writers like Chesterton, was that Jesus didn't just fulfill the Old Testament law and prophets, he fulfilled the highest yearnings of the pagan people. And if you want to understand this, you can get God in the Dock and read an essay called Myth Became Fact, but you can also learn about it by reading Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, which is like a book, almost book length essay. And if you read On Fairy Stories, the last 4 pages about, Tolkien says the same thing, that the myth, the true myth of Jesus hallows all other myth. So Jesus is the Lord of men, but he's also the Lord of elves. And I hope, on the cruise, we can start making these connections because both Lewis and Tolkien, they, they were able to look at mythology and see glimmerings of truth that pointed to the fullness of Christ.
Thank you, Dr. Markos. He keeps saying the cruise, and I guess I better let the cat out of the bag on that. Yeah, we're
Oh,
actually
sorry, I've jumped the bag.
it's we're actually doing a well. It started as an apologetics retreat, and we're gonna talk about this in just in at the end of the program tonight. But I do want you to have some context here. He keeps talking about a cruise because we're actually doing an apologetics retreat leaving out of Galveston, Texas, on a cruise ship. But we're going to be discussing these sorts of things with Dr. Ordway and Dr. Markos. So you're invited. So if you want to stick around around the end of the podcast, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And there should be a link already in the description of the video if you want to check that out. If not, I'm going to post it immediately after we're done. So, So, Holly, you have really done a lot of work, I would say, popularizing this idea of imaginative apologetics. And this is kind of where Lewis and Tolkien cross paths in a major way, whether it be Narnia, Middle Earth, and Tolkien. Another one of Holly's wonderful books, Tolkien's modern reading, where he's responding to, this is nonfiction work. If you want to read some of his essays and things like that, Holly comments on that in here. But really, what they're both known for is the worlds of Middle Earth, Narnia, and um, the Christian theology that backs this their imaginations and made its way into their stories. Many critics have come against Tolkien, saying, um, uh, especially the more atheist ones, like I think his name was Kevin Pullman, I think was one of them that said, and many have criticized, saying that, well, Christianity, Tolkien's Christianity destroyed the real story of Lord of the Rings, and some people have denied that he brought any Christianity into it because they misquote this his idea on allegory and things like that. But what Holly and Lou and I believe is that wholeheartedly, Tolkien is making a solid effort toward presenting Christianity through his work. So I'm going to let Holly talk about that for a minute and give us an idea for those that have never heard of imaginative apologetics. Can you give us some background on that as well?
Sure. Well, lots of things to talk about there. But first, I want to start actually with this idea of Tolkien. And I think it's important to know how nuanced Tolkien is, because there's lots of things going on at the same time. He's such a genius. And when he sits down to write The Lord of the Rings, for instance, what he started out to do was simply to tell a good story. He had written The Hobbit, it had been a huge success, and his publisher said, "Please write a sequel." And he said, "Okay," and started to work on that, and was writing this story that ends up, developing, getting richer, darker, deeper as it goes on, and becomes, 10 years after, what we now have as the Lord of the Rings, and which never would have happened if it hadn't been for Lewis's encouragement. So there's another way in which their friendship was really important. And Tolkien acknowledged, he says, there's a famous letter which is often misunderstood. He writes in this letter, says, "The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have cut out," he says, I'm paraphrasing now, or any overt references to religion. And that takes some unpacking, because, first of all, he says it's consciously religious in the revision, but unconsciously so in the drafting. So he didn't sit down and say, how am I going to present the figure of Christ? Well, I think I'll have this, this, and this. Now, he's telling a good story, but because he himself is so deeply rooted in the faith, it naturally expresses itself in his themes, his understanding of the objective reality of good and evil, in his appreciation of beauty, even the imagery that he uses is all very deeply Christian. But this is all very subtle, so you can read it, and not see any of that. And you don't, in one sense, need to, because it's a fantastic story, marvelous story, even if you don't see those other layers of it. Then he does say also that he's also conscious of it. He's making some deliberate choices about it, because he is aware that he's presenting themes and ideas. He says at one point, I think it's one of his letters, or maybe it was an interview, I think it's a letter, that he says that the Lord of the Rings is all about the question of God's divine power. Who has that power? The ring is a blasphemous attempt to steal, the power of God, in essence. And so that's one of the themes of it, but not the only theme. He says that another theme is death and the desire for deathlessness. So there's all sorts of things going on in the story, and they're going on at a level that's subtle, that's understated. That's why he chose to make sure it wasn't overt. And that takes us somewhat roundabout way into answering your question, what is imaginative apologetics? And this is very important to me. I taught in HCU's MA in apologetics, was actually one of the founding faculty of that program. Very proud of that program, and highly recommend it. So if anyone's thinking about doing a MA in apologetics, cultural apologetics, do check out HCU's MAA. And I still teach in it as a visiting professor. So what imaginative apologetics is not is saying, I want to tell people about Jesus and they're not going to listen, so I'm going to wrap it up in a story and maybe I can shove it down their throat a little bit easier that way. That is not what we're talking about here. Rather, imaginative apologetics is saying, okay, if we want to convey the truth of the faith, how do we do that? And how do we do that using the human faculty of the imagination? And that's something that's been really a theme of my work, the imagination and how we all have one. And it's part of our human faculties, just like the intellect and the will. And our HU colleague, Michael Ward, has greatly influenced me in this as well by his work with Lewis's understanding of reason and imagination. There's a great essay that Michael wrote called The Good Serves the Better and Both the Best, C.S. Lewis on Reason and Imagination and Apologetics. You can check that out. But the point is that we literally can't judge whether an idea is true or false until the idea is meaningful to us. And I think we can see, like as an example, 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 minus 3 is 1, that kind of, okay, these are numbers, we understand, there's math. If you're someone like me, you think, oh, math, I don't care about that. They're abstract. You might grasp them intellectually. But then what if you realize that those numbers are actually referring to the number of dollars in your bank account and you have to pay your rent? Then all of a sudden, wait a second, what's that number? Is it 0? That suddenly becomes meaningful because it has some relevance to you. Then you care whether you've done your math problem correctly. And so that's really what imaginative apologetics, in my conception of it, is about. It's about meaning making. It's about how do we help people to find these concepts to be meaningful? Because honestly, most people today, and this includes a lot of people in the church, people who are professing Christians, don't have any meaning for a lot of our Christian words, or they have a very weak meaning or a completely false meaning. So I'll give you just 2 examples. Prayer, for instance. How many people have a just distorted understanding of prayer? Oh, I ask God for stuff and maybe he gives it to me. Well, that's a very limited and shallow idea of prayer. And if you think that that's what prayer is about, and you ask God for something that really matters to you, like my grandma's dying and I'm praying that she'll be healed, and God doesn't answer the prayer that you ask, does that mean that you then believe that God doesn't exist and you abandon your faith? Well, that is actually something that happens all too often. And that's part of a crisis of faith created by just a shallow understanding of what prayer is. Or take the word sin. A lot of conversations about sin, which are so important to have because this is why we have a savior. We need to be saved from our sins. But what does the word sin actually mean to the people who we're trying to talk to? For a lot of people, it doesn't really mean anything. It's like, oh, it's the fun stuff that Christians don't want us to do. I remember going into a grocery store one time and seeing a display of chocolate cakes in the bakery, and the sign was sinfully delicious. Like, okay, well, what's the sin here? Are they lying about the ingredients? Are they cheating you on the price? No, sinful just meant, oh, it's very rich. It actually literally meant the opposite of what sin means. And that's what we're dealing with. People can't just turn that off when they hear Christians talking about being saved from your sins. So a lot of the work of imaginative apologetics is getting right down to the bottom and saying, these words that we're using, what meanings do people have for them? How do we help people have meanings for them? How do we have people have meaning for concepts like good and evil, love, friendship, God, providence? And now coming back to authors like Lewis and Tolkien, this is something that they're fantastic at because they create worlds that are very meaningful. So in, say, The Lord of the Rings, you really get a sense that self-sacrifice is meaningful. It's a genuine virtue. We get a sense of the goodness, the reality of goodness, and these concepts become meaningful to us. So that's sort of a little glimpse about what imaginative apologetics is and how these authors can kind of come into play with it.
Thank you, Holly. It's a fascinating subject, and I can't speak highly enough about HCU's program. I'm a MA graduate there, and these are concepts that I was not very familiar with at all until I started taking this program, and I was actually introduced to Lord of the Rings through a class with Dr. Markos, the theological backgrounds of Lord of the Rings, the theological narrative behind Lord of the Rings things in Lou Markos's class, and it was just so eye opening to think like this. It actually has given me life for 3 years now, I can say. So, yeah, this stuff is rich. I love hearing about it. So, Dr. Markos, he's our C.S. Lewis guy, so we're going to let him talk about Lewis, his apologetic work, the what a prolific writer this guy was. So I'm not going to speak about it. Let's just let Dr. Markos tell us about C.S. Lewis, how he used imaginative apologetics and answered
I
the
should
culture
start.
so tactfully.
I should start by saying that the story Holly told about how Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings unconsciously at first and then consciously Christian and Catholic, there's actually a parallel in Lewis because if you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you can see that it's replaying the gospel. That doesn't mean Aslan is an allegory for Christ. He's the Christ of Narnia. He's what the second person of the Trinity might have been like if he incarnated himself on a magic world of talking animals and living trees. But Lewis explains that he did not sit down and say, how can I take the Christian gospel and wrap it up in a nice, pretty fairy tale? That's not how it worked. Lewis said, I couldn't write a book like that. It started, Lewis says, with images. For many years, he'd been having these images in his head of a faun under a lamppost with an umbrella holding packages, right? Images of a white witch in a sleigh, all these images, they were all scattered. And then Lewis said he was dreaming about lions. And then this image of a mighty lion jumped in and pulled all the images together. And then Lewis explains that once the image started coalescing, he said, I need to put them into a story, but what kind of story? What kind of genre will I use? And he decided it did not want to be a modern realistic novel. It wanted to be a fairy tale. And so he's got his images, he's got his genre, he starts putting together the fairy tale. And only then, Lewis says, Lewis the craftsman, Lewis the artist, gives way to Lewis the man, the Christian. And then Lewis the man, the Christian, says, you know what? It seems to me that these stories could also um, help me with something that's always troubled me, Lewis says, that people that grow up in the church lose any sense of magic in the gospel. It just becomes old hat. It gets covered with what Lewis called stained glass and Sunday school associations, people speaking in whispers as if it was something medical. That's what Lewis says. And he said, you know what? It seemed to me that maybe I could use these images in this genre to again get past those watchful dragons and allow people, particularly Christians now, not, but particularly people who grew up in the church, allow them to re-experience the gospel story with a new sense of wonder and yearning and longing. And that's it. And Holly already said it. Lewis was able to bring reason and imagination together. Look, Americans, we have some great apologists from Chuck Colson to Lee Strobel to Francis Schaeffer to William Lane Craig. But our apologists, as great as they are, tend to be very left brain, very, very sort of systematic and logical. And that's good. But Lewis had this incredible ability to join together the rational kind of apologetics with imaginative apologetics, as Holly was just speaking. And that's what makes him, I think, the greatest apologist of the 20th century, one of the greatest of all time. And so Lewis could do the quote rational stuff, right? He could give us the liar, lunatic Lord, right? Let's look at the sayings of Jesus, right? People want to say Jesus was a good man, a rabbi, a holy man, a sage, right? Like a Gandhi or something, but he wasn't the Son of God. And Lewis says that's using logic. That's the one thing you cannot say about Lewis. I'm sorry, about Jesus. Jesus made all these incredible claims to be equal to God, to forgive sins, right? To be the way, the truth, and the life. He makes all these incredible claims about himself. Now, if Lewis, sorry, I keep doing that. If Jesus was only a good man and nothing more, and yet he makes these incredible claims to equality with God before Abraham was, I am, right? If Jesus was only a good man and nothing else, then he was not actually a good man because he was a liar, like a liar, like a devil from hell, or he was crazy like a man who thinks he's a poached egg, right? So to use the words that Francis anyway, the Josh McDowell kind of boiled it down to liar, lunatic, or Lord, right? Either Jesus was insane and thought he was the Son of God, or he was a liar and blasphemer who tried to deceive us, or he was in fact the Son of God. But he did not leave open the option that he was a good person and nothing more. He didn't give us that option, and he never intended to. Again, Lewis speaks logically like that to get us to think about what we're saying. That, look, we need to understand that if Jesus was just a teacher and nothing more, then he was the worst blasphemer who ever lived, and the Pharisees were right to condemn him and turn him over to the Pharisees to be killed. And by the way, nobody in Jesus' time said he was just a good man. Either they said he was a blasphemer and he's got to die, or they said he was crazy. His own family thought he was crazy and wanted to lock him up, or they fell down and worshiped him. Okay, that's an example. There's many examples of Lewis's rational apologetics, appealing to reason and logic. But there's also the imaginative side. I said earlier in this podcast that Lewis, throughout his life, was troubled by these moments of joy, this yearning for something beyond the natural world. Well, here's how Lewis, this is rational, but it's more imaginative because it plays to our image and our dreams and our yearnings and our desires. He says, okay, the fact that we get hungry pretty much proves that we are creatures made for eating. Right? Why would we get hungry unless we were creatures made for eating? Unless there was something like food there. Now, if there's no food, I might starve, right? But I'm made for the eating of food. The fact that I get thirsty proves I'm made for drinking. Well, I'm a Baptist, maybe not me. Well, I'll let the Catholics do the drinking. So the fact that I get thirsty proves that I'm a creature meant for drinking. Now, if I'm in the middle of the desert, I might die for lack of water, right? But my yearning seems to suggest that there is a fulfillment for that yearning. Else, where did the yearning come from? Okay, now let's make the jump. The fact that all of us, and Lewis argues that all of us, have moments of deep desire and yearning for something supernatural, so something outside the natural world. That strongly suggests that there is something outside the natural world that is the source of our yearning. Because if all there is Darwinian evolution, how could dumb, unconscious nature create in us a desire for something outside nature? If the naturalists and materialists and pure Darwinists are true, there's nothing outside this natural world. Nature's the whole show, as Lewis says. But if nature's the whole show, then where does the yearning come from? So I'll give you one more thing because we're getting late here. Lewis, I believe, gave the best argument I've ever read for the fact that we have an immortal soul. And he talks about this on the very last page of a book he wrote called Reflections on the Soul, which is a beautiful book to read. Lewis said, did you ever notice that human beings are constantly surprised by the passage of time? We see someone we haven't seen in 10 years. My, how you've grown, right? Well, of course they grew. But it's not, I still can't, I'm going to turn 60 in a few weeks. I don't feel any different than when I was 20, right? Well, I don't understand this. Time should not have dominion over us. Now, we take that for granted, that we're continually surprised by the passage of time, like that beautiful song from Fiddler on the Roof. Where is the little girl I carried? Where is the little boy at play? Right? What happened? When did they get older? I don't remember growing older. When did they grow older? Right? We all know this feeling, whatever culture or religion we're from. Now, Lewis says, let's think about that. The fact that we yearn for something outside of time, something eternal, right? That would be like a fish being continually surprised by the wetness of water. Now, that would be odd because a fish is a water animal. The fish has never known anything but water, right? He should never be surprised by the wetness of water because water is the element in which he lives. Well, time is the element in which we live. We have never known anything but past, present, and future. And yet, we are continually surprised by the passage of time. And here's the kicker that only C.S. Lewis could say. It would be a strange thing if a fish were to be continually surprised by the wetness of water, unless, of course, the fish were destined someday to be a land animal. Do you understand? We are never comfortable in time because we were created for eternity. Right? And so it's things like this. Lewis can give us the reason, the logic, the science, all of that. But he also appeals to those deeper yearnings, the part of us that is ignited when we go to Narnia or Middle Earth and we feel a yearning for. I go to the Renaissance Festival every year. I take my children, and every time I go there, I meet all of these people who I think to myself, you know what? I would have totally nothing in common with these people, right? These people, if they actually knew about the Middle Ages, they would disagree with every single thing the Middle Ages represents. And yet they're there because I think we all have that inbuilt yearning for a world of beauty, of meaningful hierarchy, of a meaningful cosmos, of a sympathetic universe. And that's where we go when we go to Narnia or Middle Earth.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Markos. We're gonna bring you guys on. We're gonna get the whole trilemma going on here with the three of us here on the screen. And for a minute, closing out here, we've had no questions. I guess you've answered everybody's questions tonight, so that's great. We did have one comment from my buddy Joe, who he said, "Thank you, Bill Scott. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you for introducing us to the passion and creative enthusiasm of Lewis and Holly." Wow. Yes, yes, yes. I thought you guys would enjoy that. Here in just a minute, we do have one question coming in, and we will answer that momentarily from our friend Riz. I'm sure you guys. All I have to say is Riz. Everybody knows Riz. Riz said random question. So we're waiting on Riz's question to come in. So okay, it just came in. So let's go ahead and get to it. Why did Screw Tape in a moment of Okay, let me read it again. Why did Screw Tape in a moment of conception turn into a large centipede? That is a good question.
He is given way to such anger and graspingness and just envy that he is literally transformed into a centipede. We get to see on the outside what he's really like in the inside. Now, Lewis, of course, was a huge fan of Paradise Lost. He wrote a book called A Preface to Paradise Lost. And something like that happens in Paradise Lost. This is what he's making fun of or parodying. And what happens is after Satan has successfully tempted Adam and Eve, he goes back to hell and he's bragging and saying, "Ha ha, I destroyed them." And really, the whole reason Satan wants to destroy us is to get back to God. He's just so petty and peevish. And And what happens is everybody starts applauding, but then suddenly everybody starts hissing. And as Satan watches, all of them are transformed into serpents. They're, basically debased. And Milton says every year, annually, they're all turned into serpents again, to kind of put them in their place.
Hmm.
But again, the power of Lewis is playing on what we do when we become corrupt on the inside, what it does to us. It's sort of like turning into a dragon in Voyage of the Dawn
Hmm.
Treader, where Eustace sort of becomes on the outside when he is on the inside, until of course he's saved by Aslan and undragoned.
Very good. I hadn't thought about those two things coming together. I wonder if Milton was commenting on the snakes and numbers that came, and I wonder if that was
Ah,
in the back of his
the
mind,
bronze
was
serpent.
the bronze serpent story. That's interesting.
It's
And see,
possible.
this is the kind of thing I really enjoy. I feel like I live in at least the first heaven here at HCU, because I get to hang out with people. I wish we had Holly with us every day of the week, but she comes and visits from time to time, and Dr. Markos is here all the time with us, and we get to hang out and talk about this stuff and have fun. And I mean, I'm sure you've enjoyed this whole conversation tonight. There's been several of you that stuck out this long, and just imagine being locked away for 5 days, where this is the topic of your discussions for a whole 5 day thing. And that's what we wanted to do with this retreat, because Dr. Markos and I are heavily invested in this ministry called Ratio Christi. And what Ratio Christi does, we try to be an intellectual voice for Jesus in the public square. We consider ourselves missionaries to the college campus, and we're trying to influence the thought lives of tomorrow. But as I travel and speak and talk to people, and I realize that there's a lot of people that have a lot of questions, have a lot of interest in this kind of thing, that we don't get to reach out to. And that's why we wanted to start doing these worldview retreats. We're trying to start an annual thing. It's not always going to be on a boat, but this year it happens to be on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. And people have asked, why a cruise ship? Well, the answer is simple. It was really just an answer of good stewardship. It's hard to imagine that when I've asked around, and people that do these big year-end retreats like this, some of them cost in the upper hundreds, or over $1,000 for some of these retreats. And then you have to talk about catering and all these other things. Well, we said, if we looked at all the options, we said, we could do this. We could take a cruise out of Galveston for an entry price of $650, and people can come on this thing, and all the food's taken care of, and it's world-class food. The lodging's taken care of, and it's world-class lodging and hosting and things. And they give us a room to talk about this stuff, and we'll get to hear amazing lectures, several times a day, and have different discussions and discussion groups and book giveaways and all these other cool things. And so said, well, let's do it. So that's what we've done. So you can check that out at www.inklingscruise.com. And there's a sign me up button on there, and if you scroll all the way down, you can see the different prices. And of course, it's going to look cheaper on there because the taxes and fees and all that have not been totaled in yet, but we've set the prices to where it's taxes, fees. If you've went on a cruise before, you know what I'm talking about. They'll show you one price, then you get charged another. We didn't want to do that. We said, okay, so what's the total cost? Total cost is starting at $650. So it might say like $518 on there. So don't get confused about that. It will be $650. You heard it straight from the source. So, so you're all invited. This is not a college retreat per se. This is really a worldview retreat for anybody who's interested in this sort of thing. And we've called it the Voyage of the Inklings. Fitting, isn't it? So yeah, while I was giving my spiel there, gave time for people to think as they wandered off while I said things that bored them maybe. They said we have a two questions, and then we'll close it up for tonight. We've already went over a little bit, but we're gonna get to Jacqueline's questions here because everybody knows Jacqueline. She's such a sweetheart. So we're gonna make sure we take care of our buddy here. She said, "I've heard that Tolkien and Lewis do not like allegory. Is that true? If so, why did they not like allegory?"
Let Holly get that one there, Holly.
Yes, thank you, Lou. I was about to seize that kind of with both hands. Well, Lewis did like allegory. I mean, he wrote his first published book was an allegory, Pilgrim's Regress. But the real question is, people think that Tolkien hated allegory, and they think this for the very plausible reason that Tolkien himself, in the preface to the second edition of Lord of the Rings, said that he cordially dislikes allegory in all of its forms. Except that's not actually the case, because he uses allegory at various points in other works. His wonderful story Leaf by Nigel is an allegory. The whole story is an allegory. He uses it in various lectures. He uses allegory when it suits him, so he does not despise it. But Tolkien has a very complex personality, slightly contrarian, and one of the things that he would do is he often said things very fiercely in very sort of sweeping terms to kind of clear the table, and then he would nuance it. So there's a number of marvelous instances in his letters where he says things like, "There is no allegory in The Lord of the Rings except for Tom Bombadil, who is an allegory of the Oxfordshire countryside." Things like that. Because what he's trying to avoid, I think, is he's trying to prevent the kind of people, the wacky fans, who would write him letters and say things like, "Clearly, The Lord of the Rings is an allegory of the Second World War." No, it wasn't. It isn't. It's not that kind of thing. And he wanted to emphasize what he calls applicability, which he says resides in the freedom of the reader to make these connections. So Tolkien's mind worked much more readily with sort of imagery and associations as opposed to, clear-cut allegory, because allegory is a very specific technical literary device. It's not the same thing as metaphor or imagery. Even the Chronicles of Narnia are not allegories. Lou already mentioned that about how, Aslan is not an allegory of Christ. He is Christ. And everybody should read Michael Ward's Plan of Narnia on this, which just beautifully unpacks the way in which it's not an allegory, but it is all about Christ. So the same thing with Tolkien's works. It's not an allegory, but there are these elements in it that point to different meaningful things, but it's not like some sort of big system. And that's the key thing. There's no system where this equals that throughout the whole work. And mostly it's, with Tolkien declaring that he hated allegory, he's sort of strategically trying to prevent people from saying very, very silly things about his book.
Very good. This was a very interesting question, and then we'll close it up for tonight. And it's probably a quick one. But Jacqueline also asks, were Lewis and Tolkien's wives ever friends? Did they know each other? That's something I've never heard asked before or heard anybody try to explain. So, was there a relationship with the wives of Tolkien and Lewis?
They did know each other slightly because, as it turns out, Edith Tolkien was recuperating from an illness in the Ackland nursing home at the same time that Joy Davidman, who was Lewis's wife, Joy Lewis at that point, was also there suffering from one of her bouts of cancer, and the two women became good friends. Not for a long stretch of time, because Joy didn't live very long, sadly. But yeah, the two women, they met whilst they were in a nursing home recovering together, and as it seems, got on very well.
I'm beginning to wonder if there's an inkling question that these two couldn't answer, because that was pretty niche and a very good answer. I wouldn't have expected all that. That's pretty great. Well, guys, thank you so much for being with us. I'm looking forward, I mean sincerely, to seeing you both on the high seas leaving from the beautiful port of Galveston. And we'll be sailing for 5 days. If you need more details on that, check out www.inklingscruise.com. Join us. Now's the time to sign up because prices are going to start going up here in the next little bit. So you can sign up today without any deposit. So you can go ahead and get your name on the list, and then our travel agent will help you with all the rest of the details. So go ahead and check that out on the website. Lou, Holly, thank you for being awesome. I
Thank you,
really
Bill.
appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Thank you, guys. So in closing, I do want to just make a couple of book recommendations. If you haven't picked up Holly's work, she has Tolkien's Modern Reading and Tolkien's Faith. I can't speak with authority on this right now, but sometimes Word on Fire Institute will have different sales and things going on. So check that out on Word on Fire's website. And with Dr. Markos, one of his newer books, as he was talking about tonight, The Myth Made Fact. Fascinating read. And here's a couple of apologetics works of his, Apologetics for the 21st Century and Atheism on Trial. Can't go wrong with either of these guys. We're very privileged to have them speaking for the retreat this year. And as we said, this is hopefully going to be an annual thing with these retreats. So be looking, if you can't make this one, look in the future. But this one's going to be from May 13th through the 18th, as I said, leaving out of Galveston, Texas, which is not too far from a couple of international airports. So it should be pretty easy to get on board. So we would love to see you out there. It's open to anybody and everybody. And as I said, we hope to see you soon. So God bless you guys. Thank you for sticking around this long on the Truth Conversation. Our next episode will be Wednesday night with Dr. Mike Lacona. He'll be talking to us about the historicity of the resurrection. He's one of the world's foremost experts on that subject, about how we can prove that Jesus rose from the dead as a historical claim. We have all the resources. It's all there. So you do not want to miss that episode. He is not just a Loctite thinker, but such a great guy. You're going to love him. So we'll hope to see you on Wednesday night, same bat time, same bat place here on the Truth Conversation at 7 p.m. That one will be broadcasted at 7 p.m. So go ahead, like this video if you haven't already, and you're sitting on YouTube wondering what to do about that. Hit a like button, hit the subscribe button, and what that does is spread this video around YouTube more quickly. And if you think what you've heard tonight is good information, if you subscribe, that means that many more people are going to be able to see it because algorithms. So there's the secret. We appreciate you guys. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate everything you're doing to support this ministry. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.